All right, so this week we're diving into a pretty intense part of DeYoung's Daily Doctrine.
Yeah.
We're looking at God's incommunicable attributes.
Yeah.
And those aren't just, like God is big kind of stuff.
Yeah.
This is like the aspects of God that are totally unique to him,
Yeah.
not things that like we as humans share in any way.
Mm.
Are you ready to have your mind stretched a little bit?
Oh, absolutely. I think, one of the fascinating things is DeYoung kind of boils it down to 5 key attributes,
Yeah.
even though some theologians like to go even further with it. But it really highlights what he sees as essential to grasping who God is.
Yeah, like at his very core.
At his very core, absolutely.
Okay, so day 31 hits us right off the bat with simplicity.
Yeah.
Now, when I first read that, I was like, hold on, isn't God supposed to be complex beyond our understanding?
Right. Yeah, and that's where DeYoung clarifies right away, simple in this sense doesn't mean simplistic.
Okay.
It's more like, imagine you're trying to break God down into his ingredients like it's a recipe.
Okay.
You can't.
Right.
He's not made up of separate parts even. His attributes.
So it's not like we can say, like, his love is more important to who he is than his justice.
Yeah, you got it.
Or his wrath.
Exactly.
Or his, whatever.
Yeah, DeYoung really pushes back against that kind of ranking.
Yeah.
Like he uses that duct tape analogy. He says God's not some ball with attributes just stuck on like random pieces. It's all one unified essence.
Yeah, that image really stuck with me too.
Yeah.
Makes you think differently about how we often try to emphasize certain aspects of God over others, right?
Right.
Depending on what's going on in our lives, maybe we're really focused on his comfort or his provision or...
And DeYoung would say all those things flow from the same source.
Right.
From that unified being.
Yeah.
So how does that change how you approach, those different needs you have?
Wow.
Does it make you pray differently knowing that there's not a love part of God separate from a justice part?
Whoa, that's a good point. I'm already seeing how like digging into these attributes isn't just heady theology. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely.
It affects how we relate to God on a daily basis.
For sure. And then DeYoung, marches us right along to day 32, which tackles aseity.
Which is a word I guarantee most of our listeners have never heard before.
Yeah, it's not your everyday vocabulary.
Yeah.
But the concept is actually pretty foundationally.
Yeah.
Aseity just means self-existence.
Okay.
And DeYoung points straight to Genesis 1.1. In the beginning, God.
Yeah.
There's no before for God.
Right.
No origin story.
Yeah.
He's simply I-S.
Yeah, so unlike all those like ancient myths, we have where there's gods being born and fighting for power, the Bible just starts with God fully formed.
Right. Fully formed.
So to speak.
And that's huge because it establishes God's ultimate independence. He doesn't rely on anything else for his being.
Right.
No pre-existing matter, no other deity, no nothing.
Right.
Which kind of makes you realize even our concept of beginning is limited when we're talking about God.
Okay, so we've got this God who is this simple, self-existent being.
Mm-hmm.
Where does DeYoung go from there?
Well, day 33 tackles a concept that's a bit more familiar, I think, but still mind-blowing God's infinity.
Right.
And DeYoung kind of breaks this down into 3 aspects,
Okay.
which helps make it a bit more digestible.
Okay, lay it on me.
Yeah.
What are the 3 ways that God is infinite?
So first, there's absolute perfection.
Okay.
Basically, God possesses all his attributes to an infinite degree.
Right.
His love, his power, his knowledge, they have no limits.
So it's not even like God is really loving.
Yeah.
It's that his love is like beyond any measure we can even imagine.
You got it.
Right.
Then there's eternity, and DeYoung points out God isn't just living forever.
Right.
He's outside of time as we experience it.
Right. No past, present, future. For him, it's all just like, well, DeYoung uses the word duration.
Duration. Yeah.
So that's trippy, like we're stuck on this timeline. But God sees it all at once.
It's really hard to wrap your mind around.
Yeah.
But, it does help explain how God can be involved in every moment of our lives without being limited by time the way we are.
Right.
And then finally, there's immensity.
Which means?
God isn't bound by space. He's not located anywhere. He can't be contained by anything physical.
Right.
So when we talk about God being everywhere,
Yeah.
it's not like he's spread thin or something.
Right.
It's more like space itself is held within him.
Man. DeYoung is really packing a lot into these short daily readings. Just trying to get my head around these three aspects of infinity is making me feel pretty finite.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's humbling.
Yeah, it really is.
Yeah.
So it sets the stage for the next attribute that we'll dive into.
Which is immutability. That's day 34. And this one is tied very closely to those concepts of self-existence and being outside of time
Right.
that we were just talking about.
So immutability, that basically means God doesn't change, right?
Exactly. And, on its own, that could be kind of a scary thought.
Yeah.
What if something bad was unchanging?
Right? Like imagine an evil dictator who was totally unchanging in their cruelty.
Exactly. No thanks. Yeah, but when we're talking about God, who's already established as this perfect, all-loving, all-powerful being, immutability becomes like this incredible comfort.
Right.
And DeYoung ties it right back to that I am name of God.
Yeah.
He simply is, and that being never changes.
It's like an anchor point in reality. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
With all the craziness in the world, with all the stuff we go through that changes you as God, is this solid rock. DeYoung even uses that image, right?
He does, and it really resonates, I think, because it speaks to that deep human need for something reliable, something constant, especially when we're facing tough times, knowing that God's love and faithfulness can't waver. That's powerful stuff.
It makes you think differently about prayer, too, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Like, are we trying to change God's mind or persuade him to be more merciful?
Right.
He has mercy unchangingly.
That's a great point. And immutability kind of changes how we understand God's actions, too.
Oh, yeah.
Because he's not reacting to situations like we do everything.
Yeah.
He flows from that unchanging character.
So even when things are hard, even when we don't understand what God's doing,
right,
we can trust that it's still coming from that same perfect, loving, unchanging being.
That's the heart of it. And then DeYoung takes us to maybe the most challenging attribute of the 5 on day 35, impassibility.
Yeah, this is the one I had to really think about.
Yeah.
Impassibility means God doesn't suffer right.
That's right.
And that can be really tough to wrap our heads around, especially when there's so much pain in the world.
Absolutely. It seems to go against everything we feel about a God who loves us.
Right.
Shouldn't he hurt when we hurt? But DeYoung lays out a really thoughtful case for why Christians have historically understood God this way.
Yeah, I'm all ears because this one really tripped me up at first. So what are some of the reasons he gives?
Well, first he points out that this isn't some new fringe idea.
Right.
The early church fathers, the theologians who really shaped Christian doctrine, they affirmed impassibility. It's been the traditional understanding for centuries.
Okay, so it's not just DeYoung's personal take.
Right.
It's got deep roots.
Exactly. And then he goes on to say if God did suffer, it would actually create some theological problems.
Okay.
For one thing, if God's feeling pain and changing emotionally, wouldn't that contradict his immutability?
Right. If he's constantly being affected by things, he's not that unchanging I am anymore.
Exactly. And it raises questions about his perfection, too.
Okay.
If suffering can change God, does that mean he's not already possessing all fullness of joy?
I see where you're going with this. But DeYoung also makes a distinction between God's affections and our human emotions.
Yeah,
right?
He does. It's not that God is some cold, unfeeling being.
Okay.
But his love and care for us, they're not subject to the same kind of fluctuations and limitations that our emotions are.
So how does that affect how we understand things like God grieving over sin or rejoicing over those who come to him? Those sound like emotions.
That's where it gets really interesting. DeYoung would say those are expressions of God's unchanging character.
Okay.
Not him being tossed about by feelings like we are. And this actually leads to his final point, which I think is the most thought-provoking. Impassibility makes the incarnation even more amazing.
Whoa, okay. Unpack that one for me.
Yeah.
How does God not suffering make Jesus becoming human more significant?
Think about it. If God as God could suffer, if it was part of his nature, then Jesus on the cross wouldn't be as unique an act.
Okay.
But if God in his essence is incapable of suffering, then choosing to take on flesh and blood and experience all the pain and brokenness of humanity.
That becomes this incredible act of self-giving.
Yes.
Of descending into our world in a way that he never had to.
Exactly. It highlights the depth of God's love for us because he willingly entered into a realm that was completely foreign to his divine nature.
Yeah.
It wasn't a necessity for him. It was a choice driven by love.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this all fits together, but I got to be honest, it still makes me wonder. Like, if God doesn't experience suffering like we do, how can he truly understand what we're going through?
Right.
Does that mean he's distant from our pain?
That's the question, isn't it? But, remember, DeYoung is careful to say that impassibility doesn't mean God is uncaring or detached.
Okay.
It's more about the nature of his experience.
So
Ah,
he sees our pain. He knows what we're going through, but it doesn't cause him the same kind of, emotional turmoil that
yeah.
it causes us.
Right. And think about it. If God was constantly being overwhelmed by all the suffering in the world, would that be the kind of God that we want to run to for comfort?
Right.
Would he be that unshakable rock, the source of peace that DeYoung talks about?
That's an interesting way to look at it.
Yeah.
It's like we need him to be the steady one,
Right.
the one who's not drowning in the same emotions we are,
Right.
so that he can actually lift us up.
Exactly. His compassion is perfect and complete, but it's not bound by those limitations of human experience. And that brings us back to the incarnation.
Yeah.
Because in Jesus, God chose to enter into our suffering, to experience it in a way that was totally unique to him.
So it wasn't just that Jesus as a human suffered.
Right.
It was God himself
Right.
in the person of Jesus,
Yes.
choosing to take on that experience.
Yes, and that changes everything, doesn't it? It means God's love for us isn't just this theoretical concept.
Yeah.
It's a lived reality. He knows our pain, not just intellectually,
Right.
but experientially, because he chose to share in it.
Man, when you put it that way,
Yeah.
it really does make impassibility seem less like this cold, distant doctrine
Right.
and more like the foundation for an even deeper understanding of God's love.
That's the beauty of it. These attributes, they all work together to kind of paint this incredible picture of who God is.
So to recap this week, we've unpacked 5 of God's incommunicable attributes: simplicity, aseity, infinity, immutability, and impassibility. Heavy stuff.
Yeah. DeYoung doesn't shy away from the complexity, but he also makes it clear that wrestling with these concepts is worth the effort,
Yeah.
because ultimately they shape how we understand God and how we relate to him.
Yeah. For me, the biggest takeaway is how these attributes are all, connected.
Yeah.
Like we can't just pick and choose the ones we like or the ones that we understand easily.
Right.
They all flow from the same source, that unified being that is God.
That's so true. And as we wrap up, I'm curious what stands out to you from this deep dive. Which attribute was the most challenging or maybe even a bit comforting to think about?
Yeah, and here's a final thought to kind of chew on.
Okay.
If God is truly unchanging, as DeYoung emphasizes, through immutability, what does that mean for our prayers? Are we trying to change God? Or are we aligning ourselves with his unchanging will? Something to ponder as you go about your week.